All right, welcome to our world history lecture on Hammurabi's Code. Still looking at the ancient Near East and the Sumerian civilization. And one of the things we talked about in our Sumer lecture was that in the elements of the of a civilization that we see arise in Sumer for the first time, and that is a written law code. And so, although Hammurabi's code isn't the very first law code in existence, it is one of the best examples and one of the most complete, I think, that we've come across. And so, our date here is 1750 BC. So you can see much later than the Sumerian civilization. That the rough date that I've given you of 4000 BC. But again, one of the earliest law codes in world history. So first point, we're going to just talk about that. Elements of it being the first law code. It's what's known as Old Babylonia. So this is not Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. That's going to be the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but this is the older Babylonian Empire. And that was an empire built by, or strengthened by King Hammurabi, who again, like many who had come before him, starting with, Sargon the Great, the Akkadian. Hammurabi was a Mesopotamian or Sumerian king who united several city-states. In fact, all the way across, and there you can see on the map, our Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf all the way up to Assyria and Nineveh, and then down into Israel, uniting many of the different city-states. You can see the city-state of Ur there, and again, the largest empire of his time. And Ur, as an example of this period, which is pretty close to our period in which we think Abraham lived, probably a little later. We think Abraham roughly dated as about 2000 BC. But the Ur of Hammurabi was about 200,000 people. So a city of 200,000 people. It's much bigger than what we're dealing with here on the Central Coast. And you can see that with a diverse city that size, you're going to need some infrastructure. You're going to need some law and order. You're going to need to maintain some things. And so not only his entire empire, but even within a single city state, you're going to need a high level of organization to manage a population of that size. So that's why a law code is necessary. What we have here, this is the famous picture. That is the Hammurabi Stela or Stele. Again, pronunciations are pretty basic, but that is basic. That is the law code. That is like a giant billboard that would be erected in the town center of all the cities, so that people would know what are the laws of this city. What is this city being governed by? What are my rights? What are my consequences? What's going to happen? And so that was one of the big steps of this law code, is one, that you could actually read it. It wasn't like in tradition. It wasn't just whatever the ruler said. It was actually codified or written down so that people could read it. And at the top there, you have a picture of Hammurabi receiving the law code from their god. So he didn't claim to be a god himself, but he kind of like Moses on Mount Sinai, claimed to have had these laws handed to him by their god in order to enforce them. And then the little scratches down at the bottom, we might get a better picture in a moment. That's the cuneiform inscription of all these 282 laws. And again, it wasn't like Hammurabi made all these laws up, sat down in his Congress or whatever. He passed them all. These were codes that for centuries had been enforced, maybe even longer, within Sumerian civilizations. And there were previous law codes. He wasn't the first one to write these down, but it's the best preserved copy that we have, and the most famous example. But he built upon those older law codes, those older traditions, and really assembled them into one body of law, and then spread that, because he was able to rule over not just one city but multiple city states. That law became consistent from place to place. Binding together that civilization, also making his way of, that law code, that way of living, what was considered legal and illegal and what was just punishment, more and more commonly accepted, because it wasn't just an isolated region's law code. It was a law code for a large civilization. Also within the law code, and we're going to read some of these as one of our primary sources, you see a view of Sumerian society, and that is you have the social classes. You have what are known as free men or free women, kind of the upper class. Then you have commoners, who would be more of the lower class and more of the manual farming labor. And then you would have slaves. And the reason you see this within the law code is that you have differing consequences depending on which class is the victim and which class is the perpetrator. And so there's different consequences throughout the law code. So if you're a free woman, a free man committing a crime, your consequence is different than, say, a slave or a commoner who commits the crime, or if the victim is a slave versus the victim being a free person, there's going to be different consequences. So we see that although we're getting a written law code, we do not yet quite see our Western idea of equal justice under the law, because it does matter who you are and who the victim is. You also kind of see different levels of consequences, not only depending on what the social class is, but you'll see two types of consequences. One is retaliation. That's where we kind of the famous eye for an eye. If there's a certain crime, then you're going to go back and commit that same crime to them or somebody in their family. Or other times you see compensation. And this is often where, again, if you see something is destroyed or something is lost or even somebody's hurt or killed, depending on who they are, you might just receive like a fine, or they might pay money to that person or their relatives. And so you see both forms. Typically, the higher class, if they're a victim, you'll have retaliation. And if the crime is against a lower class, then it's just compensation. So like a murdered free woman would require execution, whereas maybe a killed slave might just be, well, we need to pay them for the loss of that slave's labor. Another example of cuneiform in that picture. And also we see another view of their society. We see the god kings. Here's a closer up of the top of that stele. Hammurabi there in front of his god receiving the law, and that him ruling as kind of a god king. He's not ruling simply as I'm the president or I'm the prime minister or I'm the elected ruler or even I'm just a man. No, he is seeking divinity as justification, as support. I rule because this is what God wants. What I say is not just what I, Hammurabi, am saying. I'm speaking for God himself. And that's what we mean by a God king, kind of a mixing of the political, civil government, and religion, which is, again, very, very common. And we're going to see the West is going to deal with that and slowly see if we need to separate those two things. But we as human beings, we tend to relate them. And we'll talk about that later in this lecture, why that religious and divine blessing upon your rule was so important. You see views within the laws about marriage. There's marriage laws, there's family laws, there's inheritance laws. So we see the family structure was really important. Again, sometimes I think we underestimate ancient civilizations because all we see are these gray, shattered, carved up stones. We don't realize how complex and thinking and intelligent their societies and their ways of life really were. And all the things, we think we're so far ahead just because we have electricity or Wi-Fi. But again, the complexities of life were still very apparent ever since there were human beings. It's innate in us, not necessarily technology. Then also you see laws about trade, laws related to commerce, fair weights, because again, a prosperous nation needs people to have a reliable business model, and we see these laws helping to uphold that. We also see a really important foundation of Western law here in Hammurabi's Code, and that is something called the presumption of innocence. And that is the idea that you are innocent of a crime until you are proven guilty. Whereas prior or in other forms of law codes, you might be guilty. As soon as you're accused, you're guilty, and you have to somehow try to prove your innocence. Now, we see in Hammurabi's Code something that our own modern law code has embraced, and that is the presumption of innocence, which is a great thing that continues, hopefully, that we need to keep being sure to enforce in our society today. You're innocent until proven guilty. And we get the famous phrase from this law code that it shares with some of the biblical laws, and that is the eye for an eye. And that is an example of a punitive law in which you're going to punish the perpetrator and basically, physically harm them, execute them. Could be cut off a hand, tooth for a tooth, life for a life kind of a thing. And again, sometimes people look at that and they think, that's kind of a brutal law system, or that's kind of crude. Or backwards, they'll say the same thing about the Old Testament, what a brutal law system that they would call for executions, or, that if you hurt somebody and lose their eye, is it really any better to take somebody else's eye in return as a punitive measure? And I think that's somewhat valid, but the thing I always like to point out is that when they say an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, this kind of law code, whether in the Bible or Hammurabi, is being restrictive. It's actually trying to mitigate and regulate the level of violence related to crimes and when harm is done. If you've ever fought with somebody or you've ever watched kids fight, what tends to happen is if somebody wrongs you, we're not really naturally content to just respond equally. We want to respond at another level. Like if you look at me, I'm going to say something to you. You say something to me. Well, I'm going to strike you. You strike me. Well, I'm going to beat you down. Unfortunately, I see this with my children at times. They escalate the violence. And so when we see an eye for an eye, it's not necessarily demanding an extra level of violence, how we view it today, but it was saying, no, all you get to do is take their eye. All you get to do is the equal thing that they did to you. You cannot escalate this crime to a worsening degree, which interestingly enough, you actually see that in Genesis in the early chapters when you see violence spreading from Cain down through his descendants, you see an escalation, almost an exponential growth of violence, which we also see just in natural human interactions. That eventually leads to the flood when God says there's so much violence. And so when you see an eye for an eye, it is punitive, but it's actually a preventative against anarchy and becoming a revenge culture and becoming, kind of like a gang warfare, where again, you bring a knife, I'm going to bring a bat, and you bring a bat, I'm going to bring a gun or whatever, where you bring one gun, I'm going to bring three guns, where we tend to escalate because we want to win. And this is actually Hammurabi stepping in and being a referee and saying, no, 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 equal, eye for an eye. Okay, law and order. So the value of laws, why is law such a big deal? Is that it does five purposes. The purpose of law, again, one of the chief tenets of civilization, and it has five main things. It unites people because everyone realizes, hey, we're all playing the same game. We're following the same rules. We know what we have that in common when we have a common law system. It's an element of control. Like I said, a city of 200,000 people. You need rules. A classroom of just 25 students needs some sort of rules to help maintain control. That's what law allows, so that people can get along and they can function. It kind of reveals the broken nature of mankind. That in books like The Lord of the Flies, that without law and order, mankind can turn into quite a beast, just trying to get what he wants. Laws allow you to preserve things. Laws allow you to be consistent over generations, that things aren't always changing as soon as somebody else is in power or as soon as the next generation comes around. You can preserve the way in which something like, say, the presumption of innocence, because we have a codified law system of how things were done before and what allowed our civilization to grow successfully, and we can preserve that and continue prospering. That's kind of related to codify, the idea that it's written down. People know what it is. There shouldn't be any laws that are off the books or unwritten rules of the legal system. A good, just law system that people tend to obey will be codified so that they know what they're up against. You can relate that maybe to some of the difficulties we have in our society, maybe even with, I'm thinking of COVID restrictions right now, maybe dating this video, but that if the laws are always changing and you don't know what the law is, that's really puts you at a disadvantage, and that can really destabilize a society when people don't know the rules that they're being expected to live by, or feeling like they're codified so that the law that's enforced on me is the same law that's going to be enforced on my neighbor and somebody else, or maybe somebody more powerful than me. And the other value that can potentially be in law is it can limit the government. As we talk about Western civilization, one of the values of law is it can limit the power of individual people. Again, what our president can do, or what our Congress can do, or maybe our police, what they're allowed to do is in the law. And they're not just allowed because they're the chief of police or because they're the president or the speaker of the house. They can't just do whatever they want with their power. There's a law restricting and limiting what government can do. That's what a constitution is, and why that's going to be a very big deal. This isn't always the case. Laws can also multiply out of control, so that there's so many laws people don't even know what to do, or laws that even seem contradictory at times. But a good law system helps keep the government limited, and so that no one person, like a teacher, can't walk in the classroom and say, hey, this is how things are now going to be done, because there's things written in the school handbook or maybe on their syllabus or somewhere written that limits what they're able to do. And that's a good thing. Another thing just to consider, getting kind of, again, big picture of law, is where do the laws come from? Where do we get the sense of how to order and how to control and what is right and wrong? And there's basically three types of sources for law that I want you to be aware of. And those are natural law, revealed law, and positive law. Natural law is what we would call our conscience. Natural law is what we innately feel to be right or just. And a lot of times we do, that's not fair, or that doesn't seem right. That's coming from our sense of natural law, which remarkably, if you look across cultures throughout history, is pretty consistent. There's some pretty consistent principles against things like murder, against things like stealing, things like lying, honoring your parents, almost everything you would see maybe in like the Ten Commandments. Almost every civilization, regardless of what their religion was or how organized or the strength of their civilization was, they tended to agree on a lot of those basic things. Doesn't mean they followed them, doesn't mean they had a system for punishing people if they broke them, but they actually had the same natural law, and that it's becoming very clear that human beings are ruled by their consciences. That law comes from something within human beings themselves, where they have it's not like we could just be programmed to think this is right and this is wrong. We definitely can be miseducated, but there's something in our spirit or our soul or just our gut or say our genetics that commands a certain system of right and wrong. So we call that natural law. Revealed law is something like what Hammurabi would be claiming to do when he's taking the law from the God, or what Moses, taking the Ten Commandments, the Leviticus, Deuteronomy, those laws, those would be revealed law. Those were laws not from necessarily from within, but they were handed down and revealed to them by a divine source. And so things like, and a lot of times, it doesn't mean they're contradictory to each other, but you can have a law that seems to be coming from your conscience, or maybe a law that comes from God. And a lot of times when people have issues with the Bible, that's what they're fleshing out. They're saying, wait a minute, I feel like this is what's right, but this is what the Bible says, or this is what the God seems to be calling. Are these on the same page? And that creates a quandary for the human heart, because we want our sense of right and wrong to make sense. And when it's coming from multiple sources, we want to try to reconcile those to match. And finally, positive law, which is what the Hammurabi's Code is also an example of, is just laws created by the government. Things like driver's licenses, taxes, specific laws that, COVID mask restrictions, requirements. That's what we call positive law. And so you can have natural law, revealed law, and positive law. They could all agree. You could have a law that you feel like that actually is biblical and that actually feels right in my heart. And that's usually the best system. If we can put the three in alignment, then you've got a society that's going to be more likely to follow and function well based upon those laws. And sometimes you can have contradictions, and sometimes you can have certain things that, anyway, I won't get into this lecture. That'll be a discussion. But another interesting question is to ask yourself, if you're building a civilization, which one is most effective? What are people most likely to follow? Some people say, well, they're most likely to follow the government because there's actual fines and jail and maybe even execution if I don't follow those laws. And that's a valid argument. Other people say, no, it's the conscience, that people will not last very long if they're being told, even by a government or even by a God, to do things that they, in their own hearts, their own conscience, seems wrong. And so that's worth thinking about, which type of law seems most fundamental and which one is going to be most effective. Though again, I think the truth there might be that we're at our best when we get the three in alignment. Okay, last section, a greater meaning. Again, maybe even backing up even further, but why something is like the law is, to me, really important or really exciting, especially from a Christian point of view, a biblical point of view. And that is that our laws, the fact that we have laws like Hammurabi's Code, that makes us different. It makes us different than the other animals. It makes us different than other life forms, because human beings are the only species that has this idea of I should or I shouldn't, or what we might call our conscience, a sense of right and wrong, or even a sense of shame. Human beings are unique. There's something different about us, because we not only do things or don't do things, we have what we would like to do or what we think we should do. And then therefore we feel guilt because if we might do something, again, animals, they'll just do it. They don't sit there and reflect and go, well, is that the right thing to do? Am I violating my principles? Am I violating morality? No, they don't do that. But human beings all the time, we're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I should have done that. And that is that's an indication, I think, of the biblical idea that we are made in God's image. That just as God separated light and dark, and just as God had, there's right and wrong, holy and unholy, that we are in his image in that way, not in our physical appearance, but we're in his image in our sense of justice, our sense of morality, our desire to do the right thing and to avoid the wrong thing, and to fall into guilt when we feel like we've violated that. And so what I was just saying, we are unique. The fact that law systems are so essential to human existence from the very beginning is this fact that we are a species that alone feels this guilt and this shame, this echo or this inheritance from the fall. That was what Adam and Eve did when they ate from the fruit and they violated and broke from God. They fell into a state where they know, I should have done this, but we did this instead. We tore what we were doing away from what God had told us to do, maybe even away from what our own hearts and minds were made to do. And now all of a sudden there's a gap, and that gap leads to shame. And that's why they realized they were naked, they were exposed, they're vulnerable, they're falling short. There's something about a lot of us, we're our own hardest critic, and that we know I fall short of my own expectations. And that brings a lot of guilt and a burden and has a lot of influence on how we act and behave. And the fact that we are then also, we want justice. You see that in our streets, in our society today. People get motivated and find purpose in life, not necessarily just from eating and sleeping and doing the physical things and being entertained, but from saying we want to do the right thing. We want to make things fair. From a young age, one of the first, the ultimate F word, I call it, but that's the fair word. My kids, we want things to be fair. And I don't think we always, doesn't just because we want that doesn't mean we really know what is fair yet, but that just shows there's something divine within us, that we are not just about the physical world and the making of physical needs. We want things somewhere morally and legally to be in balance and to be, again, in the right column and not in the wrong column. And ultimately, again, I think this shows us the need of Jesus, why Jesus Christ is the center of all this, of history. He's definitely the center of Western civilization, but of the human experience, because we as human beings, we're all dealing with this. Everybody feels the guilt. Everybody feels the shame, and human beings have done countless different things, and we today do lots of different things to try to atone for that guilt. We invent religions, we go on pilgrimages, we give to the poor, we volunteer, we try to change the legal system, we go on protests, we do lots of things to deal with. We lie, we cover it up, we compensate, because we know we don't measure up. We know there's this standard, there's this expectation, and somehow we're falling short of it. Just like Romans says, all of us feel this, and that one thing that every human heart is longing for is forgiveness. We are looking for forgiveness, to say, you know what? Somebody save me or carry me from this burden of the fact that I fall so short of what I know is possible, of what I know I could be doing, as a human being, as a father, as a son, as a student, as a citizen, as a Christian, even. I know I'm not falling short. And that's why the message of the gospel is so profound, because it steps right into the human heart that is a just creature with a conscience, seeking right and wrong, that knows it's fallen short of that, and says, you know what? I've died for that guilt. I will take away that guilt. I will bridge that gap. Not you can't. All the religious stuff, all the good stuff you're trying to do, even your grades and your income and your life, none of those are going to bridge that gap. But I will bridge the gap from who you are and to who you could be. And that's why that is such an amazing transformative message to people from the very beginning all the way to now. Sorry, get a little preaching. I like that. That's where history comes to life, and why something as basic or standard as Hammurabi's code is really powerful. So here's our big ideas, our so whats. So whats. One, Hammurabi's code is useful because it provides insight into Mesopotamian culture. Again, the religion, the power of the ruler, the organization that was needed, the different tiers of social classes, or the different types of activities going on. Again, you just read through those codes and you get a window. It's a picture into the daily life of somebody living in ancient Sumeria, somebody like Abraham. Also, I think the law is just important because it shows the truth of the Bible about the fall, that human beings cannot, as much as we've tried, we cannot get along without law, because there's a sin, there's a fallen nature, and that there's something, again, where we just don't do what we should do, and we do things that we know we shouldn't do. Regardless of whether those come from our consciences or what our parents say or the law, and that we can't function. We need to be restrained. We need to be controlled. And that is a powerful biblical and Western concept that the existence of laws, I think, really indicates. It's important to note that law can be both liberating, once the rules of the game are clear and people are held into account, like a well-functioning classroom or an obedient society, people can prosper, people can trade, people can interact. Even learn how to disagree appropriately, or how to punish each other or retaliate appropriately to seek justice, versus, again, that escalating growth of revenge. But law can also become oppressive. Laws can be unjust. Laws can be separate from what our natural law in our hearts is saying, or separate from what we think God has told us to do, and or excessive. And so, depending on the source, the type, and the equality of the laws, some of these Hammurabi's laws, you might think they're wrong, and I want you to kind of look at that, and look for ones that. But it can be both liberating and oppressive. And so, trying to find the right law, that's a profound problem. That's a profound journey to go on, a profound project, and that's something that again Western civilization has striven to do, and I believe has done a really great job. Something we should be thankful for. We should be thankful for our law system overall. Um, and lastly, like I already kind of preached on in that third point, law is the big idea of law codes is that it really, I believe, reveals our divine nature. It reveals our divine nature of being like our Father, wanting to separate light and dark, wanting to do good versus evil, and that being one of the most profound things to the human, what we need in life to live a quote unquote good life, and also our need, the need that we have for a Savior, the need I have to be forgiven, because I know when I'm honest, the gap that lies within what I know I should be, what my divine nature speaks into my heart, and what I actually do. And that makes me very thankful for the gospel and what Jesus did for me. So again, Hammurabi's Code, law, exciting stuff. And we'll be discussing some of this next week. All right.